So, hi everybody. Like Timon said, my name is Roz Roseborough. I'm a principal analyst at Heavy Reading, which is the research side of light reading, which some of you might be familiar with. And my coverage area is cloud infrastructure and management. And for the past, I'd say probably 3 or 4 years, I've been spending a lot of time trying to understand how open source is playing a role in telecom operators' development strategies. So I've been very keen on what's happening within ONF and some of the other projects at Linux Foundation. And so I'm excited to have a group of people who are on the front lines, you might say, of open source, because I'm finding that once you get past kind of this group of folks, there's still a lot of questions about why open source, how do I get engaged, what can I expect from a benefit standpoint, how do I even get started? And so I'm hoping that today we can spend some time understanding exactly what they're doing with it, what their experience has been, and talk about what's working and perhaps what, I won't say not working, but where some of the challenges are, because I think it's important for us to be completely open about it. Nothing is perfect, and it's obviously a very iterative process with them and with the rest of the community. So I've got a ton of questions. That's my job, is to ask lots of questions. And then we'll make sure we leave some time at the end, because I'm sure plenty of you have questions to ask these gentlemen as well. So to get started, I'm going to have each of you introduce yourselves, who you are, where you're from, and why do you care about open source in 100 words or less. How about that? Andre?
100 words or less. I don't know if I can fit that in. That's a challenge. Andre Fuich, CTO of AT&T. I also serve as president of AT&T Labs. So open source, we've really embraced it, really out of necessity. And when we took a look internally at some of the large software programs we had going on, the concerns were, how are we going to support this over the long term? And when you start looking at the economics and the supporting surround structure, the technical debt, and all that happens with platforms, we quickly realized that keeping it all to ourselves was probably not the best thing. Not only that, we realized too that really what we were building internally in some cases was just an amalgamation of open source already. And so we basically decided in several key areas to build open source programs and then to figure out the strategy of how can you build a sustainable community around those platforms. And so we've talked about before here several of these networking forums that we have in the industry about ONAP, our Open Network Automation Platform. And frankly, when we put that out there, it was a tough sell. I had to convince internal management that this was a good idea. And they said, why are you doing this? We're giving away the crown jewels here, the family jewels. And it really was, well, look, you're not going to be able to afford this in about 5 years. And so when we put that out there several years ago, we're now reaping the rewards here. And we've talked about it in some of the earlier talks. A big motivation is really the leveraging effect that we now get. So for every one internal resource I have working on a particular program, I have an external resource that's also contributing. And we expect that multiplier effect to grow. And so that really was the big motivation for us to start moving towards more open source models. I know that was over 100 words,
That's
but
right.
I wanted to set the stage.
Thanks.
Yeah, my name is Rüdiger Kunze. I'm with Deutsche Telekom, head of cost engineering, standards and processes. And for me, first of all, open source is quite important for DT. But we have open source today in our networks quite a lot, but this kind of open source software that runs in the network is completely hidden because of this closed box business that we have today. So, and before we come to answer the question, why is open source important for us, or why using open source, we have to talk about the production model that we have today. So we have this black box closed shop business model, and that's what we want to, production model, and that's what we want to break up first of all. So if we have split this software and hardware, then we can talk about open source, and then open source becomes really beneficial for us if we can share resources, if we can agree on with other operators on a common base, especially if we look to the Open Networking Foundation with the reference designs that we have set up. This makes then quite a lot of sense if a lot of operators join this kind of community and bring things forward.
Does this work? Okay, that's better. Hi, my name is Jim Wanderer, and I work at Google. I've been working with the platforms team that produces technology for our data centers. So I've had the good fortune to work for quite a while on producing networks that go into our data centers. Open source, there's so many dimensions to it, but the things that are important in the area I work in are, I think, are number one, spurring innovation, right? So it's hard and slow to change things in networking. There's so much interoperability concerns. It's expensive. With open source, as Andre says, we get that collaboration, and there's an avenue for innovating. And the other part is how do we avoid purely proprietary systems? So in large companies, we can build things that work just for us, but it may be a dead end. It becomes purely proprietary and limits choice. And so I'll be talking tomorrow a little bit on another panel about why we're doing this, but I would say in brief, it is to maximize our optionality and choice about what we can get and how we can build our solutions working with others.
Okay, so we'll start hitting the hard questions. How about this one's really not so hard. I'd like for you to talk to me a little bit about how you decide whether to kind of work with open source or do it on your own. I don't know if there's any particular criteria that you use. Is it a matter of timing? Is it a matter of how unique it is to your business? Something like that, if you guys can share a little bit about that.
Yeah, at AT&T, I mean, we've aligned our open source projects around the sort of our core competency programs. The programs that we feel that, hey, these are areas that we need to be really good at, where we need, as Jim said, we need that innovation, we need that speed, we need the benefit of a greater community, especially an area that's advancing fast. So, when you think about SDN, you think about AI, those are, natural places. And, software's, pardon the pun, but software's hard. It's not easy. And also when we take a look at what are the criteria, what do you really need to make this successful? And oftentimes, it's not a technology problem, it's a people problem. Can you find the right people and roles to support it? Traditionally Operators, they're really good at architecture, they're really good at engineering, and they're really good at operations. They haven't necessarily built software development expertise. And so that's where these communities have to get very well defined. And it's not just, hey, we need good software developers. We also need the surrounding support that goes with it. Really good software developers aren't really good, really good at documentation. So you need you know, they need help there. There's that whole community that's really important for a program to be successful. So, you know, back to the question, we look at all those dimensions and then figure out, hey, how can we help incubate, help co-create, collaborate with others to build enough critical mass so we can have a sustainable community.
Yeah, so where we use open source and where it's easy to open source, I think it's for us as an operator from the end-to-end point of view. It's easy in areas where you run commodity equipment, where it's possible to use commodity hardware and commodity software then on top. So that means, for example, best place here, the ONF, with its projects on the access and aggregation, that's quite easy. That's not leading edge compared to more the backbone things, where we talk about huge bandwidths and much more features. So in access makes it quite a lot of sense, and we are not using, sure, we are competitors, so we are operators competing each other. So if we talk about service offerings to our customers and more on the service creation side, then we have to differentiate, of course, and then not using open source and sharing things.
So I think about this question in two ways. One is, when would you use open source? And in our projects, I think we would use open source whenever it makes sense. So for example, Open vSwitch has been around a long time, and back when we first started with SDN, it was a huge accelerator, right? It saved us a lot of time, and it allowed us to jump to something that we could understand and make work and iterate on. So using open source in these type of projects is really, really obvious. The other side of the coin, when do we decide to open source something? That's certainly a harder question. But what we've started asking is, what is the value of keeping this to ourselves? And in a lot of cases, there really is no longer much value. The value of keeping it to ourselves is greatly outweighed by the opportunity to work with others.
Nicely said. All right, so what would you say the main challenges are of working with open source, be it ONF projects or others? Again, because you mentioned kind of the skill set issue, perhaps not as much of an issue for some companies than others, but I know when I've talked to Deutsche Telekom, even AT&T, some others, getting the right people on board who are comfortable working with the code. So is that the biggest challenge, or is it more about technology issues, process issues? Is it selling it internally? Want to talk about some of those things as well. Like, so I want to get a balanced view of what it's like to work with open source. We don't have to go in the same order every time.
Yeah,
if you don't want to. Who feels really strongly?
Okay,
about
okay,
it?
I'll go first.
There we go.
So for us, working with open source, I think there's really two main issues that I run into, which is probably a little different than other roles, since we're very much a development organization in my group. One is the licensing, right? So I think the ONF has picked out the perfect license, right? It's maximized reuse and flexibility. Not all open source projects are like that, and licenses and burdens and IP is very important. And anything we produce or use, we need flexibility, because with the businesses that our technology gets used in, I can't really tell you what we're going to need in 18 months. Where we're going to have to deploy this, who's going to use it, who's going to be managing it. I have no idea. So licenses are critical, and that can be a big deal. And when you have a big source base and you're drawing from multiple open source projects, the licensing can get very complicated. So I think it's very important to simplify there. At the other angle is, for an open source project, well, how ready is it for real production, right? How mature is it? How's it being used? And if you're the first penguin off the iceberg, right, there's going to be some danger and some pain. And I think that we need test infrastructure, we need documentation, and we need to know there's a certain velocity of changes. You need a community to know that your changes and fixes can actually go back and get incorporated. And so from the various open source projects I've had experience in, we've run into problems in all of these areas that take time, and it does go back to the people and the community.
Yeah, exactly, that's the point. So for us, challenge is harden the thing to productize the software, and scale is a challenge for sure. It's easy to run a small pilot or a POC. It's much more difficult to bring this up to millions of customers. That's a big issue. On the other side, we are an incumbent operator, and we have a long history with a lot of legacy and skill and reskilling, and the transformation internally and the process changes for sure are a challenge for us as well.
Yeah, I would echo both what Rudy and Jim said, and perhaps add, certainly the skill sets can be challenging, but I'd also say getting back to the community and having a sustainable support structure around it. We're all familiar with very successful open source based projects out there, and part of the reason they've been so successful is because they have a very strong supporting community around it, and optionality, because everybody's level of software skill, given the application of it, they're at different levels and they have different competencies. And we're all familiar with like Linux as an example. Well, there are a lot of support structures and companies that have hardened it, that can support it to any degree to integrate it that you want, and that's what's made that platform so successful. Going into big data space, same thing with Hadoop and Spark. It's a very common theme and model there, and that really, and I'm glad you asked this question, because if you take a look at a lot of these great projects we have here at ONF, and this is part of the big puzzle here, the challenge that Guru gave us, is we need to build that support community around these platforms. A lot of these operators would love to take these projects and deploy them, but they need help. And that's where we need the community to really step up, vendors to come in that do have some of this expertise, and provide support models that you can monetize, so that you can make these projects successful. So I would say that's one big area on this laundry list of challenges.
Okay, good. Kind of along that vein, thinking about what do you think is the most important thing that needs to be done to be able to accelerate the adoption of open source? I think you mentioned that documentation is a concern. We start talking about some of the day two things, operationalizing things. And again, I'm curious whether it's a technology thing, is it getting people on board, or is it processes around open source? We were just touching upon that in terms of how do you support something that is generated by a community where there's not a single person you can say you need to go fix this. So maybe talk about some of the things that either that you're working on within ONF, or just on your own in terms of how we can accelerate and get more of this open source into the larger telecom area.
I'll give a perspective too, since frankly this is a big discussion at the board we have at ONF. There's a lot of opportunity here, and as you could, as you've seen already, a lot of different projects here, and so, frankly, the real, the big issue for us is where do we focus? It's pretty easy to do 10 things crappy, but it's hard to do one thing really well, right? So we want to make sure that, you know, we've kind of created a pretty big menu for you. And this is why this conference, the next several days, are so important. We really want to see where we can build momentum and focus in some of these areas. And what are the ones that, you know, aren't so important? Or are there alternatives already out there that might serve us better? So I think that's part of, you know, the challenge here we're working on is really, you know, really to drive these focus. And the ones we, you know, we really double down on, do them really well and make sure that all these longer term issues have a clear path. You know, I'll tell you, we're only going to do SIBA at AT&T if we're confident that 3 to 5 years from now, the SIBA community will be much larger and stronger and moving faster. And so we have to see those early indicators, you know, for us to make that bet. And, you know, it is a bet at this point. And so we're, you know, we're on the good faith side here that it's going to happen. But this really gets back to, we really need a lot more folks to get their feet in the water here and make this happen.
Nothing to add on that. So exactly the point. So we discussed this currently in the board, and focus is really important. And that's maybe the point where we can work a little bit harder and better as operators, because of, yeah, sometimes the directions are a little bit different, and to bring really points forward, and with the resources we have currently, a good focus and a strong focus is needed. Absolutely right.
So I think very much related. I mean, the thing that popped into my head was the need for the users, and in this case the operators, to converge and agree on the common use cases and goals, right? If we can define something that really does clearly solve a useful problem for all of us, then I think it's very easy to get the resources and focus. There's the potential of the market, and I think that's where the ONF really provides a lot of value, is bringing these operators together. I think that's the forum. It's certainly not easy, but that's, I think, what I've seen to be some of the best things that have happened is this convergence of goals and understanding what problems we're trying to solve.
Okay, I'm going to we're going to try to bring a little bit more specific now, to the extent that you're able to talk about it, because I know it's kind of a touchy subject. Whether you can talk a little bit more specifically about some of the plans you have for specific projects within ONF. I mean, Guru put up a slide that showed kind of a whole full stack of things from, you know, operating systems all the way up to orchestration. And so when I saw that, I was thinking, well, there's obviously ONAP, which is doing some of those same things. So are you looking at what's coming out of ONF as kind of a full stack thing, or is it that you plan to take portions of it, you know, portions of those projects and deploy those? And I would imagine it's different for each of you, and perhaps different answer at different point in time. So maybe talk a little bit about how you take these projects and get them actually implemented into your networks. We don't need dates or anything. I'm just kind of curious how this thing is going to work, because I know that's kind of touchy stuff to talk about.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, you know, from an AT&T standpoint, for example, there are pieces of the stack that, you know, Guru showed you that we're likely not going to leverage, and some that we will. You know, just as a quick example, XOS. We have an orchestration automation platform, ONAP, that's already there. ONAP for us is really critical because, frankly, it's already in place running a lot of our traditional networking assets. The reason we are we're using ONAP not just for the orchestration and the automation and all data analytics and go on down the list, but we're really using it as a bridge to get us from the old to the new. And that's really, really important for the types of networks that AT&T has. You know, AT&T has been around a few years. AT&T is an amalgamation of many, many network stacks and frankly islands. And so to, you know, to be able to move customers seamlessly, you know, in a reliable, stable way, you've got to have a master conductor to do that. So again, just as one example, ONAP is one piece there. Certainly as you move down the stack, ONOS as a controller, not exclusively ONOS as a controller. We have many controllers. As you know, there's several out there. We have a hybrid where we're going to use both, or a lot of different controllers, depending on the specific domain where it makes the most sense. So, you know, the short answer is for AT&T, it's really going to be a mix and match hybrid.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's actually an important thing to hear, because I hear sometimes from operators, they say, you know, how can I possibly consume all that stuff? They think it's an all or nothing kind of proposition.
Right.
And I think you're here to tell them that, no, you can, you know, take the part that you want and start with that, right?
Yeah, so but that's not so easy, I think. We are focusing, if we look to the reference designs and to the ONF work, we are focusing quite a lot on this Volta stuff, the virtual BNG, and we plan to productize these things. We selected a code development partner. We will hear later on in the next talks of my colleagues. So Manuel mentioned this. So there are a lot of talks today and tomorrow about the Access 4 project and more specific details. I don't want to tell too much because wanting you addressed and excited about the things coming up next days. But we are focusing quite a lot on Volta, first of all, and on the virtual BNG side. And that's our focus with regard to the reference designs. There are additional activities in the ONF up and running, the so-called trailblazing activities. So therefore, we have a use case discussing with several subsidiaries within Deutsche Telekom. On the EPC side, so the M-Cord stuff is quite interesting for us as well. So we focus on fixed mobile substitution, and if we look a little bit more into the future, fixed mobile convergence cases as well. But if we look to fixed network and the highest priority at the moment, then Volta and the virtual BNG are our cases.
So being a large software company where we've developed a lot of internal infrastructure and all sorts of services that have been built up, it is very difficult for us to take, and probably doesn't make sense for us to take an entire system and plop it down into our environment. We tend to, you know, so for example, ONOS doesn't really fit, you know, how we build things. So we'll build some of that technology ourselves. But on the other hand, there's a lot of components of open source that are in these projects that make perfect sense for us to grab, right? So I think that, you know, Stratum is a pretty big component, and that fits in nicely with the emphasis on interfaces. In other areas, in platforms, you know, we might care about firmware that runs on a BMC. Is that a board management controller? Is that something that's an open source? So looking at SIBA and UPAN, there's you know, the entire system is not something we can adopt, but I think it's important that an open source project have a complete solution, because everybody's going to want something slightly different, and the only way to really finish these components and make them usable, I think, is to put them in some sort of operational or full solution design.
Okay. Want to talk a little bit, again, kind of practically speaking. When do you decide to try to seed an open source project? I know, I think Andre touched on this a little bit, but interested in kind of the advantages and the pitfalls of doing it that way. I guess there's a chance that you could, seed something that nobody else cares about. That could be a downfall. Again, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm curious about how you make that decision, what your experience has been doing that.
So with Stratum, it was a little over a year ago, so it's moved pretty fast, that we decided, well, we really want to see innovation. We think that open config interfaces and P4 runtime interfaces were where we wanted industry to be able to provide us options and solutions. And so the decision was, let's start this open source effort to see if we can get industry traction, drive industry. And yeah, could it be nobody else cares about it, right? So other operators are critical. And I think the vendor participation we've had has been incredible. It's been very enthusiastic. But how do you create a project where vendors have a promise of seeing some return on a predictable time frame in their investment, right? How do we work with the vendors and work with the other operators such that this is something that is not just a research project that goes on forever, but it is also something that is of value to all the operators. And so I think we've been trying very hard. And one of the benefits of doing open source like this and bringing as many people in early on, even though it's a challenge because it starts off a bit chaotic, is to make sure, the thing that we have in mind probably works for us, but it probably doesn't work for everybody. So for getting a lot of different perspectives and a lot of discussion, a lot of compromises, I think it evolves into a product that's much more general purpose.
That's fair.
Yeah. Again, nothing to add. So same for us. So you have to create the momentum and get a feeling if a topic is really beneficial for a huge group of operators or for a huge group of people to move forward and create this community. So that's, I think, and we are involved as well in a lot of R&D projects in standardization at leading edge topics and with a lot of colleagues. And you get a feeling in these discussions and meetings if you talk with others, with other operators, with other suppliers on certain topics, if a topic is beneficial to move it towards an open source project.
Yeah, I'd only add, before going out and seeding a particular project, there's a lot of sort of pre-discussion I'd recommend happen to make sure that you can get enough critical mass of a community around it before just plopping it out there in the open and hoping everyone's going to come to it. So sort of doing that legwork first, I think, is really important. And it may seem obvious, but you really have to do it. Otherwise, you could try to make a big splash, and it could end up being a big dud. And then the other problem we have is oftentimes, depending on the buzz technology du jour, you have a lot of folks that want to be the first to put something out there, and if the seed isn't robust, then all of a sudden you get immediate fragmentation and others, and frankly generates a lot of noise and inefficiency. So I think a coordinated pre-effort is really important, just to make sure that you can start off on the right foot and get it on a sustainable path.
Okay, good. So I'm going to have one more question, then I'll open it up to the audience, who I'm sure is dying to ask you guys a few things. So what advice would you give to the service providers who are thinking about getting involved in open source broadly or within the ONF specifically? Again, some of them say, well, I don't have you know, a horde of software developers I can throw at it. But I'm sure there are other ways they can contribute. So what would you say to those folks that might be sitting in the audience now?
You know, I think back to the challenges, I think they're less on the technology side of things. They're more on the people, organizational leadership side. So my advice would be to make sure that within your firm that you have the right leadership support behind this. Especially in larger organizations where there's a lot of turf and kingdoms and frankly antibodies and inertial effects that could go against your open source project. And as anything in its infancy is very vulnerable. So if you don't get something out there that's stable, that you can build on and convince your constituents, yeah, this is going to work. And I'm not going to be calling you every Friday night at 11 p.m. for an outage. I mean, that's part of the whole process there. So I'd really, I mean, I know there's a long list of others, but that's one I would say is really important, probably for the larger service providers, making sure you have that enough leadership support to sustain the bumps in the road, because you will have them.
Yeah, and I think sometimes you have taken a risk as well as an operator and as a company to go forward and go towards a different direction. So, this is not an advice, but if you want to have a sustainable business model in, let me say, the next 10 years, for example, then you have to take that risk and proceed and try new paths. And that's what DT is doing, for example, as well. So with the A4 project, we run exactly a completely different path and going forward. And yeah, I just can invite others to do the same. And with the ONF, we have a good place where operators can work together and bring things forward. And support here is quite well appreciated.
I would add that advice, that's hard to give, but I think thinking a little bit medium to long term about where you want the market to be, where you want the technology to be, and where you want your capabilities. So in terms of hiring people, employing people, developing expertise, open source has had this wonderful way of giving people opportunities and understanding, and a really cheap way, in some ways, of learning and being able to make things happen in non-traditional ways, where it's not just a statement of work or an RFQ. That technology can be developed. And so I think it's a way, this, participation and then maybe a deployment might be two different things. But in terms of participation, I just think it opens up so many doors and so many opportunities, and thinking about it in how you want to get and develop technology in a different way, and look at that value. It's not just landing a product. I mean, obviously that's the goal for most of this, but how do you develop that expertise, and how do you provide influence to the industry?
Okay, great. We've got about 6.5 minutes left. Are there any questions in the audience? I see one in the back. Can we get a mic over to him?
Thanks for sharing. So, question associated with the development of the ecosystem so that it's rich and vibrant and leverageable by all. Historically, things that are certified tend to get interoperated or shared, such as carrier Ethernet services. I'm wondering if you have any advice or see a day when something equivalent to Metro Ethernet Forum 3.0 is applied, so that something is open and certified, which might, I don't know, provide a little bit of stability when someone's thinking about investing in something that could be reused. Is there is there a place for certification of something? And if so, when would that happen?
Yeah, I think that, the question obviously has to be, in a particular context of what we're talking about. And you referenced MEF, and, MEF started out more as a standards-based organization, a forum, and obviously is evolving more into software. And I'd say that was one of the things that with ONF, and if you look at the journey of ONF and ON Labs, we really wanted not to be a standards-based organization. We felt one of the key principles was speed. And, traditionally, I hope I'm not offending anyone here, but standards haven't been so much about speed, in the traditional sense at least. And the other aspect of this is once you start getting into, I'm not disagreeing that certification isn't important, it absolutely is, but once you start trying to conform to specific specs, there's always winners and losers. And there's the sort of lowest common denominator effect that happens too. And all of that, in a way, can impede speed. So at ONF, we're very cautious about this because we believe speed and stability are the key differentiators here. And from a certification standpoint, that's where we think, again, back to the larger ecosystem and community, where some operators, where they really need that, they can, hopefully some vendors out there can step up and help provide that. But, I would say it's, again, we have to be careful how we balance that going forward.
Yeah, with regard to the MEF, so in comparison to ONF and other standardization bodies or open source communities. So we as Deutsche Telekom are focusing on open interfaces, open APIs, same as MEF is providing and going forward. I'm not sure if the certification topic is still needed at the end. Because if you look to the internet, BGP is working without any certification between suppliers, operators, and who else. So it's working because it's needed because of we want to interconnect different network islands at the end that forms the internet. So question, is this kind of certification model needed? I don't know exactly, but open interfaces, APIs to connect networks, to connect towards the customers makes quite a lot of sense.
Certification, I think, has been super important for the hardware we use. I'm not sure about software either.
We got one here and one there. One more. Yeah, one then.
Question for the telecom service providers in the panel. How do you operationalize this? I mean, in the past, you've had one vendor, one throat to choke to go, troubleshoot this. It appears to me that this becomes very complex to troubleshoot. You don't know, you don't control the entire supply chain. So it becomes a different organizational and technological issue, and operationalizing is a challenge. And then related to it, another question, how do you differentiate yourselves between each other?
That's a great question, and I kind of at risk of repeating myself from the earlier question. I think that organizational structure is really important. If you don't have the right structure where you can, a true, DevOps structure, and you have the commitment of the leadership to make that happen, then if you're fragmented where, your architecture and your engineering, and maybe your build team are in one organization and your operations team is in another, all of a sudden you could potentially get those conflicts where the ops team says, hey, look, I want that single throat to choke. I've got a great vendor that's been doing it for me. I'm compensated based on these KPIs. I don't like your science experiment, right? That's why I go back, if you don't address that early on in your firm structure and get the right commitment and buy-in, then you are setting yourself up for failure. Ideally, where we've focused our particular efforts is where we can, frankly, control that. So we can get through the early bumps in the road, because we all know those are inevitable, and it's making sure we all have the stomachs for that. Because and then you can get to that point of scaling, and then you build confidence, and then the firm understands, oh wow, this is amazing. How, look how fast your speed is. Look at your how much more agility you have. Look at the better economics you're now getting. And so again, I think that's probably the most important piece in the beginning, is getting all the right buy-in and commitment to make that happen. And I totally forgot your second question.
How do you differentiate yourself, given everything is now open?
Well, look, the open source piece, I mean, we sort of touched on this. The opportunity here is where you've got commoditization going on, and it's like, gee, why are we reinventing the wheel here in each one of our companies? Why don't, this isn't what we need to be differentiating ourselves on. This is the genesis of, I would say, most open source projects out there. The projects AT&T we're embarking on, yeah, we are seeding and putting a lot out there into these various open source projects. However, there's also a lot of secret sauce that we don't put out there. And that's what we believe is our differentiation. And that's what will allow us, to be, provide a better service than perhaps Rudy's company.
Exactly. That's the point. Differentiation and competition on the service offerings, for sure. So how to address the customer, understand the customer, what the customer wants from us, and be better than your competitor at the end. So especially here in the US, we differentiate quite a lot with T-Mobile, and as the Un-carrier. And the first question was the operational topic. So we have a huge transformation within the company. And so this is not only a reskilling thing. So this addresses all the layers, all the stuff, and to get things up and running. So I mentioned the change of the production model. So if we want to do this, then we have to transform the company quite a lot. And Turk Telecom mentioned a transformation process or program in the panel before. So I think all the carriers and the service operators do this kind of things. You mentioned the operational units, bring them together with the engineering, We have DevOps kind of things and so on. So there is a huge topic up and running. But this transformation needs time. This is nothing. We are not a Google. We are a classic operator with a lot of history. I mentioned this, and this takes definitively time. Yeah.
Okay. I think we got one more question, and then it's going to be lunchtime, I think.
In the beginning, Guru had mentioned that there is an issue around the stability and the quality of the software, that it is not production ready, production quality. So what are the challenges, or why is that, and how is ONF addressing it? Like, is there a CI/CD system in place? Are we following, with Google's leadership, are we following those principles as the software is being built for ONF? And what are the challenges you see ahead?
Who wants to take that one?
Well, I would say the obvious is that any software system, you know, even basic ones are super complicated, right? And until they go through some sort of, you know, trials and use cases, the problems will not be resolved, right? So best practices in development and automated testing help you make changes and not break everything. But if something's never been deployed in a production setting, no matter how simple it is, it's going to run into issues, whether it be a TCP/IP protocol type stack or whether it be a big router. And there's just a lot of investment to be made there. And I think having a lot of operators that understand use cases and have abilities to put things into trial is a huge advantage. But it is a big investment, right? It's you know, writing the software is just a small part of making a working system.
Yeah, I think you have to have a really robust process to support, you know, a CI/CD model. Again, because a lot of this, sure, the initial phase is to get it in and prove stability and that you prove the functionality, but ultimately you have to scale it. And if you don't, you know, again, have these foundational pillars in place to do this, and you're building it all on the fly, you know, those are just more risk points for failure. And again, this gets back to, you know, a lot of this is really hard to do internally if you don't have those skill sets and have that long-term experience, because it just takes time to build that. Then you have to rely on a healthy ecosystem to provide that support. And so we're hoping many of the folks in the room here that are really good at these particular areas can come to the table here and start helping, you know, those operators, those service providers that might have some of those deficiencies.
Okay. I think that's it. So we'll be around. Well, I'll be around. You guys will be around. So I'd like to say thanks to the panel, and hand it back over to Timon.
Thank you.